Thank you so much for the introduction. I hope everyone is well caffeinated after lunch. As she mentioned, I'm the data visualization artist at the University of Vermont Complex Systems Center, but actually I'm coming from a fine arts background, and so I've been really interested in kind of the intersection of arts and science and how they can inform one another. And as I was thinking about this during my fine arts program, I was kind of thinking about the similarities between the scientific method and the iterative design process, in that they're both systems that we undertake, and we kind of iterate on our ideas and we make mistakes, and actually that making mistakes is a really critical, important part of the learning process, both for science and for design. Also, in my art practice, I kind of found myself moving increasingly from the figurative to the abstract, which I think is kind of a direction that science is going as well. As some of you may have noticed, we're kind of moving into this realm where previously a lot of our visualizations were looking at systems that already had a positional encoding. So maybe they were geospatial data points, or we were looking at topologies of systems like wind or energy or geological movements. And so now in this kind of realm of data science, we have this whole new problem with visualization of like, how do we make sense of these really abstract data sets, a lot of times that are very high dimensional. Who here is working with high dimensional data? And I've always been wondering, so how do people define high dimensional? Like, how many features do you need for it to qualify as high dimensional? Most people working with like 10 variables, like 15, like 50, more than 100, anyone? Yeah. So, you know, it's the spectrum, obviously, and I think that visualization has some well-documented historical instances of working with data that, you know, can go up to like 10 variables. We can kind of think about them with radial plots or parallel coordinate plots. But when we get into these realms of like literally hundreds of variables in a data set, it can become really overwhelming. So why visualization? Some of you may have seen this data set before. If you have, no cheating, but if you haven't, can anyone looking quickly tell me the difference between each of these four tables? It's kind of difficult. We can do the traditional statistics method, so we'll take the mean, the standard deviation, the correlation, and the linear regression of each of these tables, and we find that they're identical, statistically speaking. End of story. But when we actually plot them, we find that they're drastically different data sets. And so this is a really great example of a set where when we do those traditional statistical measures, we don't really get out the fidelity of information that we really need, or the story that we want to tell. This is another data set created by some folks called the Data Source Dozen. So it's another set that also each graph here has the same mean, standard deviation, and correlation, but when we actually plot them, we get some really beautiful pictures that are very different from one another. Another kind of case study that I really enjoy is Bioinformatics. We're studying CRISPR, and they wanted to understand kind of how we could encode information in DNA sequences. And so the picture on the left is a GIF of a horse running, and they took the data from that picture and they, using CRISPR, inserted it into a gene. And then they evolved these colonies of bacteria for generations and generations. And then from a new colony of bacteria, they extracted the same snippet of genetic material and they parsed it back into the GIF. And so we can see from this image kind of where some genetic mutation happened in the way that the bacteria were reproducing. But having a visualization like this kind of allows us to make sense of a broader picture and can kind of bring people's attention to concepts that they might not have really been interested in if it were just numbers sitting on a spreadsheet somewhere. So the work that I do is at the University of Vermont in the Complex Systems Center. Specifically, I work a lot with the folks in our computational story lab. And so what we're doing is leveraging science and technology to look at population dynamics. And we also are an interdisciplinary research hub. So we have folks that are working with ecological systems, epidemiology, bioinformatics, social media analysis, and kind of all coming together and looking at how these complex systems have some similar characteristics. So this kind of comes as a reaction to where we were in science with the golden age of reductionism. We had the invention of the microscope and started understanding how cells work, how atoms function, how proteins fold, and we really at the turn of the 20th century, we're breaking down information into its tiniest parts and just looking at all of the constituent parts that make up something larger. And we got a pretty good idea of all of the little pieces, but then the question was, how do they all fit together? And so, we might understand the cells in a tomato plant, and then we might understand the life cycle of that tomato plant, but then also how does that plant fit into a larger food web, etc. And so I'm really intrigued by the idea of the holon or holonics, which is basically the study of things that are simultaneously a part and a whole. So an atom is, unto itself a whole thing, but it's also part of molecules, it's part of cells, all the way up into the body. Similarly, we can think about bodies existing unto themselves, but also we're all kind of coexisting in this room together and reacting to one another. And so these complex systems require kind of a new model of thinking about relationships. We can also look at things large and small and see similar phenomena. So here are just some GIFs that I quite enjoyed of systems that are qualitatively very different, but they have some similar phenomena and can be modeled in similar ways. So if you want to learn more about the Complex Systems Center, we're always sharing really cool stuff studying emergence. That's our Twitter handle. And so my kind of working definition of a complex system is one that is distributed with many interrelated, possibly networked parts. It's not governed by a centralized control, and it exhibits emergent behavior. And so we see these kinds of systems in all different fields all over the world. These systems oftentimes have qualities of universality. So even though they have different micro details, they may have similar macro behavior. And that brings together scientists from a lot of different fields, which is really exciting. So one example that I really enjoy, kind of tangential to complexity science, is Aristid Lindenmeyer's L systems. So this was developing like a mathematical explanation for the way that trees grow. And so we start out with just these really simple kind of fractal-like shapes, but very quickly we can evolve them into these really beautiful renderings of flora that looking at this image, it's really hard to tell that it's computer generated, but game developers use L systems all the time now for creating these infinite worlds where we have lots of different trees. And you can set different parameters on these mathematical equations to emulate trees from different places. So whether we're visualizing maple trees from Vermont or aloe plants here in San Francisco, they kind of all have this sort of mathematical grounding. So when we study complex systems, if we think about other scientific fields, like geologists use hammers for working with rocks. Astronomers use telescopes for looking at stars. And for us, we use data science to study complex systems. And so when we think about how we're going to use data science to study these complex systems, we think about what kinds of tools we'd like to develop that can kind of be generalizable in the same way that the L system model is generalizable to lots of different plants around the world. And so if we think about measuring systems, this is one from an art project that I was working on with aquaponics. So there's a soil moisture sensor, and as moisture is added to the soil, it kind of plots in the background the addition. The question is, what kinds of tools do we want to build as data scientists that can generalize to these complex systems? Some tools that we've built, this is the Hedonimeter. It's available online, but it's average happiness for Twitter. So we had people rank words on a scale of 1 to 10, context independent, on how happy they were. And then we aggregated all of these ratings. We left out the ones that had high variance. So a lot of swear words, actually. People said they were either really happy or really sad. But most of the words, actually, there was a consensus about what the kind of average happiness of that word would be. So we took a random 10% of all tweets that have been sent since 2008, and we broke them up into single words, and then we calculated what the sentiment was for each day on Twitter. And so this is just an example of yesterday. What words were being used more or less. So the word love was being used more, which was kind of pushing our measure up, but then a lot of these other words were being used more often as well, which were sad words, and so that kind of pushed it down. So this is an interesting tool. You can go and look. We found that the happiest days are really predictable, so it's like Christmas Day, Mother's Day, and the really sad days are the unpredictable ones. So those are natural disasters, celebrity deaths. The 2016 election was a very sad day on Twitter, which is obviously not a representative sample, but so it's an interesting tool because it kind of gets us to start thinking about systems of people and population happiness. Another study that we did was looking at sentiment when people were visiting parks, and we found that people's sentiment was on par with Christmas Day in terms of how happy they were after spending time in a park. So definitely get outside when you get a chance. We can also use these tools to look at things like how people are eating and when people are eating. So this was just the incidences of breakfast, lunch, and dinner on Twitter, kind of normalized to the hour of the day and local time. We also, at the Complex Systems Center, are looking at health in terms of sleep and how often people are sleeping. So this might be, a plot for a single person for a whole month of how much sleep they're getting. But then when we aggregate those measures, we can get maps. So this is a map from the CDC showing what percentage of people are sleep deprived. They also found that lack of sleep is directly correlated with a lot of serious health conditions. So in the few days after the spring forward daylight savings time event every year, they see a drastic increase in the number of heart attacks. So when we're looking at these systems, we're kind of taking this interdisciplinary approach and talking about network structures in a really general sense, and thinking about the interrelationships between nodes and what the edge weights are. So this is just an example of like two different types of networks that have very different measures of centrality and randomness. And so thinking about things in terms of graphs really helps us kind of make sense of this really tangled web of interrelated systems. So this is the famous Königsberg Bridge problem. People for years in this town were wondering, is it possible for us to take a path that allows us to cross every bridge only once? And a mathematician came up with the idea to turn it into a graph, and very quickly was able to find that it's just not possible given the number of nodes and edges in the system. So a lot of times when we're building these network graphs, we kind of think about them in two visual perspectives. The one on the right here is a matrix, and so we see that we have a value for each pair of nodes in the graph, and then on the right we actually have the graph visualization. So in this instance, there's only one value in this system. It's 1, or I guess it's binary, so there's 1 or 0, but we might also think about graphs that have weighted edges edges, so you could have a whole range of values for each pair of variables. So right now, what I'd like you to do is just kind of on a piece of paper, on your laptop, just think about, like, with the sets that you're working with, what's like one example of a network that you might create where you have nodes and edges drawn between them. And maybe if anyone wants to shout out some examples, share what you're working with, that would be great. Yeah, what are you working with?
I had a problem last week. I had lots of variables that had multiple unity with them. And I didn't have like a useful way of like eliminating some and going with others. So I thought of a useful graph where I'll eliminate nodes that were, let's say 3 edges pointed to one node. Then I'll take that node and eliminate the other variables.
Right. And what kind of data were you working with?
It's weather data. It's based on the global forecasting model.
Oh,
so
cool.
A lot of those variables are probably to think about temperature, dew points, pressure, and a bunch of other things.
Yeah. So a lot of times when we're working with these systems, we start with pen and paper. I think that there's definitely a tendency nowadays to like dive into like, okay, how do we build this model right off the bat? And it's really important to kind of actually take a step back and just like whiteboard, draw on paper, and think about, for example, if we were looking at a system where we were talking about individuals, say individuals in this room. We might want to think about a network graph where each individual has a line drawn from themselves to the other person based off of how well they know each other, whether they work together. And so we might end up with a graph that has lots of disconnected components because not all of us know each other. Then if we were to take the same nodes and think of another statistic, for example, combinations of interest, then we would have a totally different graph. And so I'm really interested in kind of taking a meta-analytic approach and looking at the relationships between variables, so that rather than having 500 network graphs for each of our single variables, having a network graph that shows the relationships between those variables themselves rather than the individual nodes or individuals in the data set. We'll go into this a little bit more. Here's kind of another example, a really classic example of a network, Les Miserables, where we have a network graph on the right and a co-occurrence matrix on the left. And so this is a data set that has, I think, 65 nodes in it. And so we start to see very quickly how these things can kind of like balloon out when we're thinking about individuals in our data set as nodes. And so looking at feature graphs, I think, can be a way to kind of avoid that hairball problem when you have like thousands of individuals in your data set, and kind of take more of a bird's eye view approach. There are some other really interesting network graph visualization systems that I'm not going to touch on today, but you're welcome to look at slides later. These were some examples that I quite enjoyed. The one above is a combination of a network graph and an adjacency matrix. And so what we have is when people are very close together, it can be hard to kind of pull out what the connections are. And so they're detected like clusters within the network and visualize those as adjacency matrices, but then used kind of the outlier nodes as individual nodes in the network graph. And then on the bottom is biofabric, and so that's a way of kind of organizing your data set into a kind of a combination of a network graph and an adjacency matrix. There are a whole bunch of measures in network theory that I'm just going to touch on briefly, but that kind of help us understand the structure of the networks themselves. So when we talk about, say, epidemiology, or when we're trying to understand how power grid failures happen, maybe we want a less connected network, and so this network on the right here has low connectivity because each individual is only connected to their immediate neighbors, whereas this kind of random graph in the middle has high connectivity. The one on the far right here has high centrality, and so there's this really interesting factoid in network science that on average your friends have more friends than you, which is kind of sad but also really interesting to think about. So if you select a random person in a network and then you select any one of their friends, on average their friends will have more friends than the person that you initially selected. It's this kind of interesting characteristic, and the reason for it is that by virtue of them being connected to you, we've already gained some information about their connectivity. So obviously it's not true for every person in the data set, but on average, your friends have more friends than you. So in the world of visualization, we're really used to looking at these visual encodings and saying, you know, when we have the first two variables, okay, that's my x and that's my y. Maybe we can look at some other encodings like color and length and area, contrast and texture, to add in additional dimensions, but I'm sure lots of you, as well as I, have seen some graphs that maybe have one too many visual encodings. And so I'm a big proponent of, even though I'm working with high dimensional data, like if we can get it down to maybe only like 3 or 4 visual encodings at the most, that's kind of the best way to do it. Cursive dimensionality is a real thing. But there are some other approaches that we can take to help us kind of understand those more high-dimensional strategies. So as I mentioned before, radar graphs and parallel coordinate plots work moderately well when you have 5, 6 dimensions. It can be a little bit tricky when they're not orthogonal to one another, or when you have a lot of data points across your variables. But that's kind of an interesting starting point. And then there are all of these dimensionality reduction methods that work using components or projection. So if you're here to worship at the altar of Teesney, I apologize that I'm a false prophet, but that's not where we're going today. So obviously there are considerations to be made when we're taking these data sets in high dimensional space and kind of shining a light down onto them and looking at them on a table. We get kind of like the Plato's cave analogy problem, where you're not actually seeing the entire robustness of the data set itself, you're just seeing a projection of it. Although there are some really interesting things happening in the data science world in terms of manifold learning. So this is just an example of locally linear embedding, where you have some shape in high dimensional space, and basically by looking at the relationships between individual nodes or individual points in your data set, you can kind of unroll that shape and put it down on a piece of paper. And then, of course, Pca and some systems like that, where you're basically saying, okay, these variables are kind of similar to one another, so I'm just going to kind of collapse them all into one and say that's going to be my new angle into a lower dimensional space. And so some of the methods that I'm introducing here today are kind of maybe first steps towards some of these other dimensionality reduction methods that can help us kind of understand which variables are working with one another and which ones might make sense to kind of put together. But the workshop that I'm giving today is mostly about developing like exploratory tools for data scientists to kind of parse out those variable relationships without projection in kind of like a black box model. I know a lot of you are working in areas of finance and healthcare, and we have a lot of issues these days with algorithmic bias and what happens when we just put all of these variables into a model and then spit out some result at the end. We have this kind of crisis of explainability right now that can cause bias in hiring decisions, in the way that people are treated for healthcare, all kinds of things. And so I'm kind of being an advocate here for maybe like before we jump into these projection dimensionality reduction methods, kind of having a critical eye and doing some exploratory analysis of these feature relationships ourselves as scientists. While I did mention with Anscombe's quartet that we have this problem sometimes that when we look at summary statistics, we don't really get the whole picture of what's going on in the variables, in the pairs of variables, but it can be helpful to come up with some measures that give us more information on a broader scale. So this is an example of taking that same Twitter data that I showed before. We kind of took the ambient sentiment, or the average sentiment on a rolling basis, broke it up into years, plotted those years on top of one another, and then looked at the sentiment turbulence, so the amount that the sentiment was changing in that window as like an absolute value. And this kind of confirms some of our other research that we're doing, looking at word turbulence and how people are just using more words more often, which you may have felt in like experiencing the news cycle recently, that they're just like, oh, there's a story here, there's a story here, like there's a lot more kind of going on, and that also maybe is a result of just the number of people interacting online on a given day increasing. But some of those measures can kind of help us pull out a story as well. So what I've done today is I've created a Google Collaboratory notebook. It's available at this link. This is my first time teaching a workshop with Collab notebooks, so let me know if you have technical difficulties. I know that the internet here can be a little bit shaky, so if you prefer, you can go up and just download the notebook as a Python file, as a Jupyter notebook, and then you can run it locally on your machine. So the way that this works is it's kind of like any other Google Drive document where you can view and you can comment, but it's also like a Jupyter notebook. If you're not familiar with Python, that's totally okay. I kind of designed this so that you could theoretically just run each cell and not do a whole lot of like coding yourself, but you're also welcome to write your own code. And so if you'd like to be in an editable version of the document, you can open in playground mode, and that will allow you to kind of create a copy of the Google Collaboratory notebook and use it on your own machine, save it to your Google Drive, make any changes that you want, or you're welcome to just follow along as we go through here. One thing that I found was helpful is that there's this table of contents over here. So if you don't have that panel, if you go up to the very top left, there's a little arrow there and you can pull that out. I used Markdown to kind of delineate the different sections of this notebook. So if you get lost at any point, that's a good way to kind of get back to where we are. So the way that this works is similar to other Jupyter notebooks. You can do Shift-Enter to run a cell. So what we'll do first is import our data processing libraries. Pandas is a great tool for working with data frames, which is very similar to R data frames if you're coming from the world of R. NumPy has a lot of just general like math tools for numeric processing. Random is used in this notebook for sampling. It's just like a helpful tool for kind of, especially if you're working on a slow connection and some of these things take a little while, you could maybe take a subsample of the data set and work with that. And then SciPy is a really great library that also has some really cool tools for projective dimensionality reduction as well. Visualization libraries here, mostly we're using Plotly. How many people have worked with Plotly before? Oh, cool, so a good number. I really like Plotly. You know, in my process as a visualization artist, when I'm building like robust user interface tools, we're doing the backend processing in Python, but we're using D3 and JavaScript in the front end along with React. But Plotly is a really great tool for prototyping. It's really quick to go from having an idea to having an interactive visualization in a notebook that you can share with people, which is just really helpful for collaboration and getting your ideas out and being able to play with them. So there are a couple kind of dependencies of Plotly here. If you have decided to run this as a Jupyter notebook instead of a Python notebook, or instead of a collaboratory notebook, you can just remove this line here. This is the Plotly IO system's way of saying, hey, we're in a collaboratory notebook instead. And so if you take that out, it should run fine in a Jupyter notebook. NetworkX is a great tool for understanding networks and for processing them, and it has some really robust functionality for computing things like degree centrality and adjacencies. Eric Ma from Northeastern presented, I think, earlier yesterday on some strategies in NetworkX, but they've bless you. They've been really vocal about expressing that they are not a graphing library, that they're for network processing, but they really encourage folks to use other network graphing libraries for the actual visualization step, which is why we're using Plotly. All of the data I have on my GitHub here, so we're just storing that into a path variable. And then these are the 3 data sets that we're working with. This may seem kind of like rudimentary, these data sets. They're intentionally designed to not require a lot of data cleaning. They're relatively small, although they are have a lot of variables. And the reason for this is mostly just to make this workshop accessible to beginners. But I have used some of these methods that I'm demoing here in much larger data sets that did require a lot of cleaning, have a lot of missing values. And so there is some functionality kind of put into this notebook to catch some of those edge cases that we don't actually see in these toy data sets. So if you'd like to give it a shot uploading your own data set, you're more than welcome to. The other thing is that we're looking at 2 different network visualization methods here. One is for data sets that are all binary values, and the other is looking at all quantitative values. And so if you're interested in some of the strategies that I've been using for looking at, pairs where you have a binary value and a quantitative value, I'm currently in the process of doing research to create mutual information networks, which allow us to discretize those quantitative values and then perform a kind of calculation of the entropy loss over pairs of variables. But that's kind of a lot for a workshop. And so we're just kind of, for the sake of simplicity, breaking it up into a binary example and a quantitative example. So first we'll start with this binary set, the grocery set. And so what we do here is kind of the initial, let's just look at our data and see what we have. This one is, I think it's close to 10,000 groceries purchases. There are 169 grocery items in here. And so in this instance, we're just kind of treating each grocery item as a feature. But you could imagine that this might generalize to areas where we're looking at whether or not someone lives in a house or is renting a house, whether or not someone owns a car, whether or not they're going to college, that kind of thing. So there are, like I said, 9,835 observations. We have all of our features here, which we're storing in a list called features. That'll be important later. This is a step, kind of just a sanity check, looking at like what are the responses for each of our features. This is a nice thing to have, especially when you're working with data sets where like we have one healthcare data set where sometimes it's true false, sometimes it's nan and 1, sometimes it's 1 and 0, sometimes it's the string true or the string false. So this might be a place where you would want to encode those things all as one type. Here's another function that doesn't really apply to this data set, but if we had any features that were entirely null, we might just want to drop those from our data set. So now we're going to create our first analytic frame. This one we're calling the supported data frame. So in this instance, it's basically just a one-to-one encoding that says, you know, it's either a 0 or a 1. But when we're working with data where we don't have a response, sometimes the fact that we don't have a response is data unto itself. So for example, I have one set that's life insurance, and so if they asked you a question about how often you rock climb, it's probably a sign that like there's something unique about you that you know, the fact that they didn't ask it to someone else actually gives us information, and so we might want to encode those as 0 or false. So now we're going to do our first visualization. So we're just creating a histogram here that shows the number of true observations and then how many people, how many rows we have for each of those. And so this here basically says that like most people only bought one grocery item. And it's very rare that we have anyone that bought more than, you know, 15, 17 grocery items. So if we visualize this data as a heat map, it's actually still kind of comprehensible for us. This might not be the case with other data sets, but that just kind of gives us an idea of, you know, where the instances are. And in that this is an open data science conference, you guys are more than welcome to repurpose this code and use these methods in your own data pipelines. So when we talk about support, we have this data frame already, which is whether or not somebody you know, bought these grocery items or whether we have a response for these items. But when we start thinking about pairs of variables, we want to understand what the relationship between those individual variables are. And so, you know, we'll see that whole milk was one of the most commonly bought items. Sound storage medium is very rarely bought. I guess CDs are kind of going out of fashion these days. And so we can then visualize a histogram of our support, so how many people we have a response for, or how many features we have a response for. So then we can start understanding our pairwise feature support. So this is a simple piece of code that will take a random 2 features and kind of compare the 2 of them. And so if you rerun this cell over and over, you'll get different results, which is just helpful for like kind of randomly exploring your data. And then once we have something that seems interesting to us, we can create the confusion matrix, and that will show us you know, most people didn't buy brown bread or specialty chocolate, but for some of these other ones, we might see a more kind of even distribution across each of these categories. And so we basically build this new matrix that is looking at every single pair of variables and calculating the support for both of them. So given that somebody bought sausage, what's the probability that they also bought liver loaf? And that support cell can take a little while to run. Any questions so far?
Can you go over what the confusion matrix is showing you?
Oh, sure. So this is basically just saying whether somebody bought both products or not. And so in this example, X is false because they didn't buy specialty chocolate, but they did buy brown bread. So 275 people didn't buy chocolate, but did buy brown bread. And we can run that again and see various other ones. Most of them kind of look like this because of that long tail. So that's saying like most items aren't very well supported, weren't bought by that many people. And this is kind of a common feature that we see in networks, is that there are these kind of long-tailed distributions. Cool, so now we have our support matrix. And this kind of tells us, what the co-occurrence is of these things. Some of you may be familiar with association networks, which is kind of where we're headed now with this binary set. But these kinds of methods, I think, have correlates in other like variable combination strategies. So then now that we have that matrix, we want to create a visualization of it. I should go over some of the like Plotly visualization features also. So Plotly creates visualizations using this graph object figure. And so that's kind of like a wrapper that includes graph object graph type, so it might be heat map, it might be histogram, and that information or that graph object includes, what our x is, what our y is, z if we have one, the color scale. In here, I added a hover template, so that says when I hover over each part of my heat map, what information do I want to see, and then the other part of that graph object figure is this graph object layout. And so that's where we set things like our x and y axis. So we have that support matrix, and we can visualize it this way. You'll notice that these are interactive graphics, which is another benefit of Plotly, that we can kind of zoom in and see in more detail parts of the matrix if we're interested. So kind of taking a step back from the support and looking now at building network graphs. So we're using NetworkX, as I mentioned before, for processing the actual network data. So that's basically taking a data frame and then turning it into a graph that's like nodes and edges, and computing some network statistics about the relationships between those nodes and edges. So here we're just setting, for this example, which matrix we want to use and what the title of that is. So you can kind of uncomment another one of these lines if you'd like. Oh, that's kind of small. Can everyone see that okay? Or are you like good with following along on your screens?
Can you increase the size a little?
Yeah. Cool. And so now what we'll do is define our network graph functions. I'm a really big fan of kind of chunking things up in notebooks, because it can get really out of hand sometimes when you're creating these like long lists of visualizations. All of a sudden you'll have like this single cell that's creating your visualization, but it's also doing data processing, and it's also running some statistical measures that you're saving to variables and other places, and it can kind of become a little bit messy. So what I've done here is broken this up into like really small pieces that each part of building the visualization. So the first part here is that we convert our matrix to a stack. So basically what this is doing is saying, previously I had all of my features down the index on the column, and then I also had all of my features across, as we see up here. But this isn't really a great way to feed that information into NetworkX and Plotly. And so this stack function takes that information and kind of breaks it up. So to walk through it, our stack is a data frame where we're taking our matrix. NP-TRIU is the upper triangle. So because we have a symmetric matrix, you know, if we have bread on the index and then we have milk on the horizontal for our column name, then we don't also need to look for milk on the index and bread on the horizontal because they're going to be the same measure. And so that's why we're basically saying, you know, take this matrix and just take that top triangle, and that way we get every pair of variables, but we don't get every pair of variables twice. And some of this is just extraneous data cleaning that we don't really need because it's already been cleaned. But so when we run that cell, oops, I can actually uncomment this and we'll see what that stack actually looks like. And so we'll see here that all of the features that were down the index row are now listed in X. All of the columns that used to be across the top are now listed in Y. And then we've got that measure for each of the cells. So it's basically as if we took this whole matrix and we took all of those tiny squares and we kind of stacked them all into a single really, really long column. What that allows us to do is then kind of analyze all of these edge weights and filter out at a certain threshold. So if we imagine, you know, everything is going to have some support value, and so if we create a network where we draw an edge between everything that was ever bought at the same time, we're going to end up with like a big hairball of our features. So what this does is allows us to set a threshold, and I've put some little visualizations in here as well, so that we can actually see what happens when we set that threshold. So here we'll see edge weight in this instance is our support, and then edge count is the number of edges that have that weight. And so we'll see that, you know, most things are between 0 and this teeny tiny number of their edge weight. And so if we add this threshold value in this line here, we'll see that the threshold stack is basically saying, take the stack, but only give me back entries where the measure is above a percentile, which is taking that measure and then the threshold value. So what you put into the threshold value is this filter stack by threshold. Here we're saying 95, so I'm saying give me the 95th threshold at the 95th percentile. And so that returns us with this edge weight down here, and basically it tells us down here, you know, it removed 13,000 edges from our stack. So previously it was a very densely connected kind of hairball network, and now we're kind of taking out a lot of those edges that were kind of spurious, maybe not as helpful. And so our original edge count was 14,000. Our new edge count is only 710, which makes this a little bit easier to kind of digest. But one thing that's cool about this method is that, you know, we haven't actually removed any features from our data set here. We've just removed some of the less important connections between those features. So next, what we're going to do is calculate some network statistics, and this is using NetworkX. And so we can calculate all of the adjacencies for each node, so every feature, what else is it connected to, and then also the centrality. So how connected is a node to other things and the things that it's connected to as well. So you could think about like, centrality in a network as like a power substation would have really high centrality because lots of power from lots of different places are coming into it, and then it's distributing power to a lot of other places. And so in network science, it's really helpful for us to pay attention to nodes that have high centrality for that kind of understanding of kind of the importance that a single node has in the connectivity of a network. So we'll just kind of store those network stats in a variable. Looks like my runtime was disconnected. We'll see. And so we can see here that we've calculated those network stats, and we can see the number of adjacencies for each feature and then what its centrality measure is as well. So now we're finally starting to get into the visual encoding part of this network processing. So here we're doing some spatial encoding of nodes and edges. So we are using some layout value that we pass into the function, and so I'll show you down here. NX Spring layout is the one that I'm using for this demo. But if we go to the NetworkX webpage, has a lot of really great kind of explanations of the ways in which it can draw different types of layouts. So there are all of these other methods for graph layout. So this is basically just saying, given that we know these nodes are connected to one another and they have these weights, how do we want to lay them out? So for example, there's this circular layout which puts all of my nodes into a circle and then draws edges between them that way. They're all different kinds, and they kind of have, their own positives and drawbacks. So I encourage you to play around with each of them. And so what this function does, and I'm sorry, it's kind of like, this is, I think, the longest cell in the notebook, but it finds a position based on that layout given the measure weight, in this instance it's support, saves those x and y values for the edges. So in this we have x0, y0, and then x1 and y1. So anytime that you're drawing a line, you need to have the starting point of the line and the ending point of the line, and so that's what we're doing here. Here we're also saving the x and y locations of the nodes. And in this example with the spring layout, because graph visualizations are x and y independent, like they aren't like normal scatter plots or bar plots where the x and y axis actually means something. It's more about the spatial positioning. So actually every time that we run this, our layout is going to be slightly different. But the relationships between the nodes and edges are the same. It's just that they might be upside down or in a different location. So in the same way that, when we look up at the night sky, we see the same constellations, but we maybe see them from different angles at different times. And so then I can calculate that here, and if I wanted to, I could, check out what it's actually spitting out. So these are all coordinate positions of those edges, for example. And now to the graphing part. Is everyone doing okay so far? Yeah? Okay. So here we're actually going to draw the graph. So we draw our edges. It's kind of weird in Plotly. You draw line charts as scatter plots, I guess because it's very similar. in terms of the way that you actually set the variables. So even though it says scatter, we see here that the mode is lines and markers, and so it's actually drawing lines. The nodes also are basically a scatter plot, and then we are setting the color to the centrality measure that we calculated before. We could also set it to the number of adjacencies, or if you wanted to add some of the other kind of more robust density measures and things like that that NetworkX has to offer, you could do that here. Then we can draw our figure, and sometimes it takes a minute. But so what we're going to be rendering here, because we put our support matrix into this, is basically just saying how often were two items bought together at the same time. And so a node in this graph that has like a high centrality or a high number of adjacencies would mean that it's commonly bought with a lot of other items. So we might see something that is really commonly bought on its own, but it's only bought in conjunction with one other item. So it's an interesting kind of measure to think about. Not sure what's going on here. There we go. So we'll see here that whole milk and vegetables are kind of right at the center of our network. Semi-finished bread doesn't really seem to be one that's bought currently with other things, canned fish. And so what's nice about these toy data sets is we kind of are able to kind of verify anecdotally that some of these relationships make sense. So I'm going to skip the summary of building a network visualization, but this is just basically putting all of those cells into a more kind of condensed area and creating a similar visualization using a different data set. So moving on to conditional probability and confidence matrices. This is basically in the same steps that we had done before with support. We're going to be calculating the conditional probability. So this is basically taking the support of both items, dividing it by the support for item 1 or item X. And this is kind of an initial step that will take to kind of set us up for this next step, which is lift or joint probability. So you'll notice in this visualization here that there's this diagonal line, and the reason for that is that this is the identity of the matrix. So this is where we have two features that are the same. So we're comparing the fact that somebody bought eggs with the fact that somebody bought eggs. So this is part of the reason that we take that upper triangle and we actually cut it right at that line and take everything above it when we're creating our stack for the network visualization. So next we'll be calculating lift. In this step we're going to zero out that adjacency, the identity of that adjacency matrix. And then the lift is basically the confidence matrix or the conditional probability divided by the support for the second variable. So in the previous step we had taken the support for both variables, divided it by the support for the first one. Now we're taking that and dividing it again by the support for the second one. So what lift tells us is basically given that we have a true value for feature X, what is how many times more likely is it that we also have a true value for the second variable? So we run that computation, also create our matrix visualization, and because of these long-tailed distributions, it might be a good idea to kind of set your color palette to be on a logarithmic scale, so we can actually get some more fidelity in the things that we're seeing here, because it is a little bit sparse. But it's a kind of helpful exploratory tool. Moving on, we create this network graph of lift. And this really starts to help us parse out some of those relationships that we've been trying to get at in understanding the correlations or the probabilities for different variables in our data set. So in this instance, we're seeing that baby food gives us lift for a lot of other items. So if somebody buys baby food, they're a lot more likely to buy butter and milk, bread, vegetables, and then we see some things like preservation products, salad dressing, give us a lot of lift for other features in our data set. If we were to set different measures on these visualization tools, we would get different layouts. And so once again, this is just an important reminder that it is an exploratory tool. And we're all still data scientists, and so it's worthwhile to think critically about your data and play around with like what you set your threshold at. You know, what percentile do we want to obfuscate our edges at? Which graph layouts are most helpful for gaining information? But creating something like this then allows us to look at these edges, and we could continue to filter them further, and then look at pairwise plots or confusion matrices for those variables. Other things that we might do would be to select certain clusters of variables and use those for like a principal component analysis or as features. So for example, one way that we've used this in my lab before is a big issue with life insurance is that it's really unpleasant as a customer and really costly as a company to have to do blood work and urinalysis every time that somebody applies for life insurance. And so they would really like to move towards a fluidless mortality model. And so we can use predictive analytics to kind of impute what somebody's urinalysis might return for their protein, or what blood work might return for some other value without actually having to do that lab work, by looking at one of these clusters and saying, given that 4 out of the 5 features in this cluster are fluidless, can I predict what the one fluid-based characteristic is from those? As you may know, if you've worked with imputation models or other prediction methods before, it can be really hard if you throw like everything in the kitchen sink at your model. It actually inhibits the performance, and so being able to pick out those features which are most informative and give us the most information about our target predicted variable, the kind of more easy this task becomes. So this is a summary of kind of all of the things that we did there. This is an example with another binary data set. This one only has 16 features, so it's kind of a tough proof of concept in that the network that we get is very sparse, but the adjacency matrix here is helpful in understanding more simply how these systems are working. So we see that feathers and airborne give each other a high amount of lift, as we might expect for zoo animals. But the network graph here is a little bit iffy. Over here we'll have, aquatic and fins are together. but there's only 110 animals in this data set also. So these methods don't generalize as well to really small data sets. So they're really better for working with a lot of features and a lot of data points. Okay, any questions about binary feature networks? Cool. So now moving on to feature networks for pairs of quantitative values. We're going to be working with another animal-based data set from my friend Michelle at the University of Virginia. This is a data set that has 49 animals and 89 animals and 49 characteristics. So the color of the animal, the kind of different characteristics, hairless, tough skin, do they have flippers, do they have hooves? And they use Mechanical Turk to ask a whole bunch of people what they thought about these animals. So most people said that, what is this? Beavers had a tail, for example. Similar to what we did earlier, we'll do kind of the initial ground sweep of what do we have in this data set. 49 observations. Here are all of our features, our response list. In this instance, previously it was just 0 and 1, but here we can actually take a quick peek at all of the kinds of numbers that we see in this data set. Then visualizing these feature distributions, which is something that we didn't do previously. In this example, I'm building a list of the means for each of the features. That just kind of gives us some insight into, most people said that most animals were not blue, which kind of, makes sense anecdotally. So we can sort those features by their mean, which kind of just helps us lay out this next visualization where we build a box plot of all of our features and their distributions. So, lots of animals are active, maybe not as many animals live in the desert or are blue or make tunnels. In this example, we're going to be building a correlation network graph. Correlation is helpful for comparing these quantitative distributions. It can be hard though when the distributions are really different in nature. So you'll see that some of these are kind of normally distributed or kind of centered around 50, but have wide tails, and then some of them are really close to 0 and have very long tails. What we'll be using here is Pearson rank correlation, Spearman rank correlation to kind of compare those variables in a way that's a little bit more distribution independent. So here's a function where, yet again, we can just take a random sample of any two features. For example, here, is it a ground animal and is it fierce? Some of these are kind of subjective characteristics, but we can create scatter plots comparing those features, those pairs of features. And so here's a scatter plot of each of our data points on the basis of, do they live on the ground versus are they fierce? Tigers topping out in both categories. Killer whales being fierce but not living on the ground. Once again, this is just like a a helpful tool that once we have those edges in our network, we can kind of decide which pairs of features would be most helpful for us to look at for these comparisons. Here we have some parallel coordinate plots, as I mentioned before, helpful for when you have, between 4 and 10 features, but they can get a little bit hairy after that. Here we're introducing the Spearman rank correlation, so that allows us to compare things with different distributions. And so here we're just calculating the rank for a pair of variables. Here's an example of what that looks like. So here's a parallel coordinate plot where on the farthest edges we have the original 2 variables, and then on the 2 inner columns we have what they were ranked to. So you'll see that these were all of our recordings for domestic, and the Spearman correlation kind of breaks them out into these more kind of normally or evenly distributed ranks, and the same for meat teeth. And so when we see a lot of confusion happening in between these ranks, it's saying that they're anti-correlated or maybe not correlated at all. If we saw this looking like like a loom where everything was kind of a 1-to-1 match, then that would have a high Spearman rank correlation. So we can take those original values and then look at the way in which ranking remapped them. So in this instance, this is kind of a weird plot, but we have the original value on the left x and the bottom, the left y and the bottom x-axis, and that's the blue dots here. And so we can see that most of our blue dots are kind of down in the bottom corner, and so by mapping them to a rank value, we've kind of spread them out and teased them out from one another a little bit better. From there, we can calculate our correlation matrix between features and visualize that. What I did here was actually map the correlation from -1 to 1 to a new space of 0 to 2, which is just a good thing to do for the network visualization because we can't have negative edge weights, and so just gives us some more information. And so we have that correlation matrix. This heat map here kind of gives us more information as well. As we can see here, active and slow are anti-correlated with one another. And then we can visualize our network graph. And what's nice about this is kind of anecdotally, we once again see that the spatial positioning kind of makes sense. We've got water, hairless, ocean, flippers, plankton, blue, skimmer, coastal, kind of all of those things all together in this one corner of our graph. Scavenger, meat teeth, claws, cave, meat, all of those kind of end up together as well. So those are maybe our higher up in the food chain hunter animals. Yeah. So going back to the presentation to wrap up, for these feature networks, it can be helpful when we have a lot of features to kind of understand the relationships between the features, but always important to remember the individuals that are tied to the data points and actually look at those pairs of features themselves. But as we saw before, when we had this network previously that had 13,000 edges, if we wanted to look at a pair plot of every single pair of variables in our data set, it would be just an astronomical amount of time to take. And so a tool like this, where we can filter down our edges and find kind of a measure of the most interesting pairs of variables to look at, can really kind of parameterize our exploratory data science space in a way that is explainable and still allows us to look at the individual data points in our set. So in summary, we had an M by N matrix, M observations, N features, with all of these responses. We could compute similarities for one feature between every individual, and then we might have a network of all of the individuals in our sample, and so we might end up with clusters where everyone in one group had the same blood protein value, but what we would end up with is a matrix for every feature in our data set, which could be a lot. So instead we look at the responses for each pair of features and then compute some similarity matrix between them. And this allows us to build a matrix of all of the features for our observations. And we drew edges at a threshold value set by the user as a percentile. The nodes are the features, and the edges represent measures of difference between pairs of features. I'll put these up again in a moment, but these are some helpful resources for multivariate network visualization, general data visualization tools, some other alternatives for network visualizations, and then some of our work at the Complex Systems Center. So just like a postscript on this, because I know that association networks are maybe not unfamiliar to everyone here. Correlation networks have been used a lot in bioinformatics also for gene analysis, but one of my research areas at the university is looking at mutual information networks. So when we have lots of different data types, and we are trying to make sense of the information gain across them, these strategies of lift or correlation don't work well when you've got, say, a binary value and a quantitative value. And we also have a lot of missing data, so the support measure for the binary values kind of gets at that a little bit. But there's definitely room for improvement in visualizing uncertainty and communicating to data scientists that sometimes we don't have a response. Sometimes we want to encode the fact that we don't have a response as a variable itself. We have this issue of distributions not being normal. And even within our binary values, sometimes there's an even split, sometimes they are not, and sometimes they're actually unary, so even though they look like binary values, we only have a true response for them. And so I'm particularly interested in using mutual information as a way of measuring how much we learn about one feature from another. So for example, given that we have this distribution of people's heart rate, if we segment the sample into two groups, we have people who are taking this one medication and people who are not taking this medication. How much information do we gain about the distribution for those pairs of people? So if a feature pair has high mutual information, we would draw an edge between them, similar to what we did with correlation or lift in our examples here. But feature pairs with low mutual information are not connected. So whether or not somebody checked the box for whether or not they went to college doesn't really tell us a whole lot about their heart rate maybe. And so we wouldn't draw an edge between those two in the network. But then this kind of approach of using mutual information would allow us to draw edges between features that are of different types, whether they're categorical, nominal, ordinal, or quantitative, or binary. And so I'm really excited about that kind of research. So just going back then to This slide, shameless plug, the University of Vermont is hiring tenure track faculty openings in the computer science department. We also have fellowships, not only for postdocs, but for graduate students and undergrads. So if you know anyone that's interested in this kind of complexity science or systems thinking, please send them our way. Vermont's beautiful, especially this time of year. We also have a certificate of graduate study in complex systems, a master's in complex systems and data science, and a PhD in complex systems and data science. So with that, I'll take questions. Yes?
I didn't realize you had done the same thing with the correlation matrix that I was pointing to earlier on. And I'm just interested with, you use the Spearman's round correlation.
Yeah.
I'm guessing, my reasons were, I was worried about non-linearity and not being able to take care of that. And I'm wondering if those were your reasons as well, to use the Spearman round correlation.
Yeah, that was one of the reasons. I mean, it still has an issue, right, though, when you have variable, or you have responses that have the exact same value. We haven't quite teased out like the best way to handle that. And so that ends up with like everything ends up at the same rank, the same way that it had the same value before. Yeah.
Do you have any like resources or recommendations for visualizing this where the relationships are changing over time, like the network edges are changing over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Tacoma by Ben Mayer is a temporal network visualization package for Python. It doesn't yet support edge weights or directed edges, but he did a really great job putting it together. It's all available on GitHub. There's even a demo here with, you can change, the animation speed, and he put a lot of work into, the issue with some of these other network graph layout functions is that they reshuffle the network every time, and so this is a really great package because it preserves, in a relative space, the location of the nodes while drawing edges between them. Yeah?
Do you have suggestions or recommendations if you're working on feature sizes of tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands to millions to be able to still try to pull out some of this information, but just massive feature sets?
Yeah, so while these visualizations are helpful for explaining the concepts, I think that some of the mathematics behind it could be leveraged to pull out some subsets of features prior to visualization. So some work that I've done previously was using hierarchical clustering on the nodes in these networks, and then you can get subsets of feature networks and visualize those. And that's been helpful. One tool that I also found that was great was, I don't know if I'll be able to pull it up on the fly, but there's this method that people have used in the past called dynamic thresholding for dendrograms. And so what that does is instead of you having, some hierarchical tree structure where you just pick an arbitrary height at which to cut it, because that can sometimes get you these clusters where like you've got one enormous cluster and then like a couple little teeny tiny ones. Dynamic thresholding methods are like dependent on the structure of the dendrogram itself, and so you can set a parameter that says, I want approximately this many nodes in my resultant cluster, or I want approximately this many clusters within some range of sizes, and it will actually kind of traverse the tree structure and cut at different heights depending on how well connected things are. So that might be a good approach to kind of pull those out. And then you might have, we've done some work with our healthcare data set looking at, we'll see these little clusters like we had before, this cluster of ocean creatures, we'll have clusters that are like, oh, these are all kind of tangentially related to heart disease or to diabetes, and then we can do more robust analysis on those feature networks themselves. Yeah. Yes?
Do you know of any sort of network applications to time series data?
So we're working on one right now with the Twitter data. We've got we've extracted all of the n-grams from Twitter, words, hashtags, handles for 1, 2, and 3 grams. That's going to be going live in like a month, so I'm excited to share it. And so what some of our researchers are doing are doing like a Pca Eigenfunction decomposition of these time series. So basically saying we can approximate in a way that's good enough to the human eye at least the shape of any time series with a very small number of eigenfunctions. So for example, we see like periodicity with the usage of Halloween or Christmas or things like that. And so when we do the eigenfunction decomposition, we'll see this one that kind of follows that periodicity, but then maybe we see another one that has this general trend upward, and so we end up with a coefficient for each of those eigenfunctions to approximate the time series. And so sometimes those coefficients are negative because things are dropping, but that allows us to kind of get a measure for each of the time series and then cluster them accordingly. So that's still research under development, but yeah. Cool. If anyone wants to talk to me afterwards about the University of Vermont, or if you want to be Twitter friends, I like posting science on Twitter and I love seeing all your science stuff as well. So, yeah, thanks.